Hi, I want to welcome Shane to this little short interview. And Shane, thank you so much for taking time out today to share your thoughts about leadership. And I know you have a lot of experience with that. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on a few questions as we have been having conversation about equity-focused work and what kind of leadership does that take to be able to move that work forward. So I've got a few questions and let's just jump in. So the first question is really thinking about what are the necessary conditions for doing equity-focused work? What are the leadership capacities that you need? What do you need to know and be able to do?
That's a great question. Perfect place to start. I think for me, it really begins with courage of all things, that it's very easy for us to participate in business as usual and the status quo. And I think just having the courage to have some of the hard conversations about equity, to name inequity when we see it in our schools and organizations, and to kind of push the envelope on the current ways of thinking and talking about equity. I think another really important condition is that we begin to rethink how we talk about data. I think we've been in an era where the very high level kind of satellite types of data are what drive thinking and decision making and policy. And if we really want to be equity driven and equity focused, I think we have to begin to listen to student and parent voices as a form of data, not as a nicety, but as how we are understanding the experience of our young people, particularly our most underserved young people and their families. And I think for me, the last one, as a former teacher who's really passionate about pedagogy, is just a relentless focus on instruction and on instructional quality. So we can talk about equity until we're blue in the face, but if that's not penetrating the instructional core, if we're not transforming the kinds of experiences that young people have in the classroom, then it's talk, right? And it's not actually moving the dial.
Yeah, that's really helpful to think about. Can I ask you a quick follow-up question about this idea of data?
Mm-hmm.
What would you consider data? Because so many teachers say, at the beginning of the school year, we sit and we look at achievement data or suspension rates, and the same kids are at the bottom, the same kids are at the top. There's a predictability there. Say a little more about how you would encourage people to reimagine data when you're doing equity-focused work.
Sure. I like to think about it as the need to really triangulate different types of data. So those quantitative measures, the high-level measures, they're important and they tell us something. They give us kind of an orientation to the landscape. And I like to think about those as kind of satellite data points. I think we also can get mid-level data like surveys, survey data from students, or a test like the Scholastic Reading Inventory that might reveal sort of patterns of achievement or patterns of experience. But I think where we need to push ourselves as equity leaders is around that qualitative street level data. It's the listening to young people. It's the walking into classrooms and seeing who's engaged, who's not. What's the ratio of positive to negative feedback that young people get? What are those microaggressions that might be playing out in the classroom? And I think we need to begin to think of those things as a form of data that helps us understand and push past the current realities.
Mm. So this leads me to my next question. How then do you, as a white educator, actually go about building that capacity for yourself as well as your staff? And I'll preface this that we've known each other for a long time, and I'd like to consider us allies in the work, knowing that we each bring different life experiences and can go into different places and spaces in order to kind of move equity-focused work to get it forward. So sometimes that work is done together, cross-racial team, and sometimes you need to have, an all-white team, or you need to have a white leader being able to lead predominantly white staff. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about, what does that mean? What does that look like? How do you build that if you're in that position?
That's a great question. I guess I was saying, I feel like it's a lifelong proposition. One never arrives at equity consciousness. I'm there. And particularly, I think for white folks, this is a constant commitment and recommitment to being conscious and to being aware and to being allies and co-conspirators around equity. I think it begins with awareness, and that often we may kind of leapfrog the step of really building our background knowledge about equity, the social political context, the structural factors that influence student performance, as well as the kind of more subtle, the unconscious bias and the microaggressions that play out in our schools. So I would encourage folks to really try to build that background knowledge by reading. Read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Read your book, read Chris Emdin's book on reality pedagogy, and read some of the kind of canon around culturally responsive teaching and organizational behaviors, and talk to other white educators about those things. I think that through the reading and discussion, we're able to create a more robust vocabulary about these issues, and we can push the ways in which we talk about equity in our schools. So that's one piece of it. I think the second piece for me, and I've learned this, the hard way sometimes as a white equity-minded leader, or one who aspires to be, is the piece about reflection. That we have to be willing to look in the mirror and to own our missteps and to own our errors. And that's painful work, but it's brave work and it's necessary work. So if you get feedback that you have misstepped or you have behaved in a way that was not equity driven, to be willing to say, I own that, I take responsibility for that, and I'm going to do some learning so that I can come back as a stronger ally in the work. Excuse me, that's my computer. And then I think the last piece is to take a listening stance, particularly when we're talking about leading across difference. I think this is true for all leaders, but maybe most so for white leaders, to think about how do you show up with humility and listening across difference, because you don't know everything. We come from a dominant cultural perspective, and we have to stretch our current paradigms and worldviews enough to have a more holistic and inclusive way of leading.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And here's a follow-up question, and I hear this often, that leaders sometimes fear, messing up, saying the wrong thing, and they are afraid that others will feel that the space is not safe. So how does one go about doing that as a leader? How do you create this sense of a safe space? Is that even possible? How do you usually think about that?
I love that question. And I heard a term recently that really spoke to me, that someone said, instead of safe spaces, we need brave spaces. What resonated with me about that is I think that safety, emotional safety, can sometimes become a cover for what is called like a white racial equilibrium. Take that from the literature on white fragility. So if we focus only on safety, which often means that white educators need to feel safe, then we may not be willing to have the harder conversations. We may not be willing to call out the microaggressions we see in our schools. But if we can commit to being brave together, and holding a growth mindset toward one another is a big piece of this, then I think we can stretch ourselves into the places of courage and challenge around race and inequity. I don't think it's easy. I don't think there's a formula at all. But if we can lean into this concept of brave spaces, and again, as white educators in particular, be willing to hold one another accountable, be willing to say, that didn't feel okay, or the way that you came across, I don't think you meant it in this way, but here's the impact of your words or your actions, regardless of your intentions. I think that can become a fruitful zone of learning for folks.
Thank you for that. Oh, I really appreciate that notion of a brave space, right? We're going to experience a little discomfort, but that's okay. We all can lean into that. So one last question. What does all this mean for facilitative leadership? How do you get ready to hold spaces for other adults and as well develop yourself as a leader? I know you've been in the work for a long time. You've started, co-founded high school, you've done leadership coaching and all of these things around leadership. Say more about what you would offer as primary capacity building things that one could do around facilitative leadership.
I'm glad that's where we're ending, because for me, facilitative leadership is kind of the money ball of the equity leader. And ironically, it's the least developed muscle in the muscular system of leadership. When I think back to my own principal training program or the PD that I did, it was almost never, it was so rare that we talked about holding space, facilitation, and how do you have the moves and the skills of this facilitative, equity-driven leader. So I think that's the place that we need to go. And I think it begins with transforming our spaces of adult learning. So if we want there to be humanizing, culturally responsive classrooms for our young folks, we have to create that experience for our educators. You can't get one without the other, in my mind. And we have been on this hamster wheel of initiatives, what gets called initiative fatigue in public schools. And I think we have to be brave enough to also interrupt that, get off the hamster wheel and begin to slow down and create meetings that feel humanizing and that allow educators to bring their whole selves into the mix. I think it also is about modeling curiosity about others. Leading with questions more often than with answers, not needing to always be the expert in the room as a leader. Michael Fullan talks about the lead learner as one of the highest leverage points of leadership, that you model and you sit beside your teachers as a learner. So something as simple as, do you show up at every PD opportunity? Are you there as a learner? Are you at the table in the mix, listening in on conversations and participating with folks? Can be very high leverage. And I think the last piece for me, and this gets back to the data conversation, is that we need to practice and teach our colleagues how to listen deeply to students and families. This can look like a shadow day initiative. If every teacher were to shadow a student through their day, what would they learn? It can look like building people's capacity to do home visits, right? Audio interviews with young people, video interviews with young people. How do we capture those voices and those narratives and stories as part of how we understand the experience of the young folks in our schools?
Nice. Thank you so much for that. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to share some thoughts. I know that you have a book coming out very soon, The Listening Leader, which expands on some of these ideas. And I'm so excited for folks to get their hands on it, only because I know your work and its brilliance, and that this is going to be a way for you to share yourself with them. So I want to thank you for taking time again. I look forward to seeing you soon.
Always a pleasure. Always an honor. Thank you for talking with me today.